let's talk about my top 10 sci-fi books ever. My favourite 10 sci-fi books. I actually, historically, I've probably read more sci-fi than fantasy. I don't think it's on purpose. In many ways, I prefer fantasy, but I just have read more sci-fi. Lots and lots of classic 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s standalones or parts of kind of famous series like Foundation and Ringworld and Rama and stuff. Lots of good stuff that I enjoy. I've narrowed it down to 10 or something like 10. I'm going to give two, I haven't got the books here, but I'm going to give two honourable mentions quickly of sci-fi series I really like and are valuable to me, but where an individual book does not crack this top 10, at least yet. I wouldn't be surprised if Vorkosgan Saga Memory breaks that. The first of those is Vorkosgan Saga, therefore. Great series. I've got, I think, 16 books in it that I've read about half of. I've got a Why You Should Watch video on this. And that's sprawling character and concept-based space opera. The other one is Hammers Slammers. Again, got a Why You Should Watch video on it, which is intelligent, realistic, and calm. It's hard. I don't know how to describe it. Military sci-fi, kind of reflective. Now onto the top 10. So those are my honourable mentions. No individual novel has broken the top 10. 10. Again, I haven't got the book for because I literally don't own it. Whoops. I literally don't own that book. It's called This Is the Way the World Ends by James Morrow. The only book I've read by Morrow, and the other stuff I've seen about him or by him doesn't appeal. But in This Is the Way the World Ends, what basically happens, I think, is that a guy, to get a nuclear protection suit, to get an ABC suit or something like that, makes a deal where he will take responsibility for humanity's sins that led to the nuclear war that he wants protection from. And so he is, after the nuclear war, in the future, he is tried for his crimes, i.e. humanity's crimes. He has become the scapegoat. And there's a kind of defence of this. There's this trial where there's a very compelling prosecution, very compelling defence. But it's also him investigating his grief, understanding what's happened since the war, and coming into contact with people, the various people affected by humanity's actions. It's very, very powerful and strange. I don't know, I read it 5 years ago. I don't know what I'd think about it if I read it now. I don't know if I'd like it more or less. But I thought it was a really good book at the time. And it has stuck with me as an individual novel in a way that lots of good individual sci-fi novels have. Something like Gateway by Frederick Pohl is very good, but it hasn't stuck with me as much as this. 9. This one is kind of an easy one. I've got a review for this up. Dune. This is the trilogy, the first trilogy. Dune is incredible, isn't it? It's not a perfect book, but it's one of those books that kind of functionally is perfect. By that I mean there are flaws. I could say, oh, I didn't like this as much or this as much, but the things it's trying to do, it's just perfect. In it, you have in the far future, a kind of noble house takes over a very valuable planet from their rivals as part of an imperial deal. But there are obviously plots within plots and wheels within wheels, and the force of destiny, of racial human destiny, species destiny, driving everything along. Marvellously inventive, marvellously insightful, and a much more thoughtful, ecological and political, particularly on those kinds of areas, book or story than maybe we realise. Even though people think of it as very good on those things, I think it is more thoughtful on those because less simple, because less one note than people perhaps give it credit for. Number 8. Use of Weapons by Ian M. Banks. This is representative of the culture as a whole. There's a couple of books in the culture series, and I've read about 2/3 of the culture series, that I really like. The first book, I think, of all things, might have been Look to Windward, which was baffling and beautiful, and I loved it. Player of Games, also wonderful. X-Session, I did have to literally have a word file taking notes on who was who and what they were doing. But X-Session was great. Use of Weapons, though, I think for me is my favourite of the ones I've read, because of there's a very clever kind of clashing parallel timelines storytelling. There is, running essentially in opposite directions. There are really interesting moral questions examined, like Banks generally does, examined quite soberly. And I think one thing I think is interesting about the Culture series is that it's like Star Trek in that it's utopian. It says, look, we will go to the stars, everything will be amazing, like we will actually become better. Space communism will cure everything, and you can take your view on that. But I think Banks doesn't shy away from the fact that utopias have costs. It's something that Star Trek only really gets into by the back end of DS9. It kind of touches on earlier than that, but really only gets into it at the back end of DS9, and then largely forgets about, really. I think I get the sense Picard's done a bit of it, but not necessarily as successfully, or popularly at least. That's number 8, Use of Weapons. Number 7, Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny. I have a review of this up. In this, you have a world which seems to be ruled by Hindu gods. But there's a weird thing. Well, obviously, there's something else going on, because there's those of modern technology, or rather far future technology. There are obviously plots and politics going on, weird things happening about who these gods are. And one of those gods, who is often known as Buddha, he's the one known as Buddha, but prefers to be known as Sam. He has views about this. He wants things to be a particular way, and he's our main character, and he's an excellent character. It's an excellently envisioned world. Zelazny is probably one of the sleeper writers in the modern era. When we look at how classic writers get neglected, one reason is that people are like, oh, I read Ringworld by Niven, it seemed outdated, or whatever, in various ways. You read Clarke, you say, oh, well, his own writing is often quite cold. The same perhaps with Asimov even. Asimov is so much of a genius that it maybe surpasses that. But Zelazny combines all the things we like now. I think there are different things. There are trends that mean he's neglected, and there is stylistic questions where we are used to a different thing that means he's neglected. But he really is neglected, and I think Lord of Light is a very good book that if you like, as I said, I've got a review of it up, if you like clever, poignant sci-fi, it's a very good place to go. This is 6, I think, I hope. Cormac McCarthy, The Road. These aren't in a strict order. This, I think, sometimes might rank higher, but this is how I'm ranking them today. The Road by Cormac McCarthy is a literary novel, nominally sci-fi. It wouldn't be on the sci-fi shelves, but it is. There has been some kind of disaster. I think it's allegorically at some level a climate disaster, perhaps, but it's presented. I think it seems like some sort of chemical or nuclear disaster, and there isn't really food. It's basically a post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear wasteland, and there are cannibal gangs, and there's no food anywhere or whatever. And there is a father and a son pushing a trolley of food around, defending themselves from all the people out there who might harm them. And it is, it's one of those rare cases, especially in a literary book, where you get ridiculous kind of review quotes. But this is one quote from the back. A work of such terrible beauty you'll struggle to look away. And here's another one of the most shocking and harrowing but ultimately redemptive books I have read. And again, McCarthy conjures from this pitiful flight to the miracle of unswerving humanity. Those are all profoundly fair statements and important. I value books that value humans, and this is a book that values humans. It makes a declaration about the evil of humanity, the bad things we end up accomplishing, like destroying the world, or could accomplish. But it ultimately says other things too, they're a belief in the better angels of our nature. And so I think if you are interested in a beautiful, difficult, complex book, not complex intellectually, but complex emotionally perhaps, and sometimes structurally, then I would recommend it. I think you'd enjoy it. But yes, that's Cormac McCarthy, The Road. Number 5, we're into the top half now. I have a review of this too, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Annoyingly, the other books I've got in the Hyperion Quartet, which is I think one Sci-Fi Masterworks with yellow for Hyperion Falls, and then the other two are also from Gollancber in blue and black, are all trade paperback size equivalent, whereas this is, I guess in American terms, mass market. It's really English paperback. In Hyperion, it's the Canterbury Tales. There are 7 pilgrims. They are on their way, because there's this issue that the human hegemony is threatened by both humans outside of it, kind of adapted to deep space, and dangerous AIs. And these 7 pilgrims go to a world on the edge of the hegemony called Hyperion, which has the Time Tombs, which have this weird mythical figure, the Shrike. And in some way, Hyperion has touched each of these 7 pilgrims, and you hear their stories, Canterbury Tale-esque, in different genres and different styles with different purposes. Very, very powerful book. Very structurally clever. I've read books 2 and 3 in the quartet. I do think Hyperion Falls is basically as good, or nearly as good. Maybe I run against the tide there, but Endymion the 3rd was solid, and I will read, I think, the 4th this year, Endymion Rises. But 1 and 2 are both great. Hyperion particularly, though, is structurally such an impressive accomplishment and so bold in what it wants to do. There's an interesting way in which the fact that the other books do not mirror the same structure is intentional, obviously, but also indicates that Simmons was kind of willing to leave a story unfinished for the purpose of finishing it structurally, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. He had an idea, he accomplished it, and then when he thought, I could probably continue this, he continued it in the right way by his lights for the story. Number 4, I read this last year for the first time. I have a review of it up, Neuromancer by William Gibson. I will hopefully read the 2nd book in this cycle. There are 3 novels and some short stories in the Sprawled trilogy. Really nice modern covers as well. I really like that. A massively influential seminal cyberpunk book. I mean, it's where the term The Matrix comes from. He had previously come up with the term cyberspace. We are talking about an important writer in terms of our ideas of how technology and society will interact and merge. And here it's a kind of noir novel about a hacker getting involved in weird human and AI politics. Stylistically excellent. It's not particularly long. It is under 300 pages, in fact, in this edition. It's stylistically beautiful, as I say. It's structurally complex, and by that I don't mean that there's not anything. It's not like use of weapons with the different timelines going opposite each other. It's more that you don't plot-wise, the way the plot is revealed is obliquely, and with a magician's flourish. So there is a prestige as things come together. It's a really satisfying book, and important historically. And not all historically important books are also super satisfying, so give it a go if you find that interesting. Number 3, not Ender's Game. This is Ender's Game. Ender's Game is great. Is not Speaker for the Dead, which I don't own, though Speaker for the Dead is great. Xenocide, the 3rd in the Ender Quartet, is the one for me, which I don't think maybe wasn't out by the time this was published. I don't know. Sorry, not Xenocide, Children of the Mind. Children of the Mind is the 4th book, and most of us do not think it's quite as good as the others. It's alright, but the first 3 are all excellent books. 2 of them won Hugo's. Xenocide was nominated, and Ender's Game and Speaker of the Dead are very different, and I think the great accomplishment of Scott Card's early career is that he publishes these 2 books that are like very different, and people are like, wow, these are so different and great. But then there is this. Then he also publishes a fantasy series, the Alvin Maker series, which kind of functionally feels abandoned. He's got 1 or 2 books left to make in that, which haven't appeared for a very long time. But in the 80s, he also publishes the first Alvin books, and they're also great in this fantasy America that never was. But yes, Ender's Game is a military sci-fi book about kids being trained to take part in a war versus intelligent ant people, the Formex. And then that's really different to the 2nd book, Speaker for the Dead, and he basically wrote this because he wanted to write Speaker for the Dead. So this is the prequel, which he released beforehand. Speaker for the Dead is about this guy who goes to funerals and he speaks the truth about the person there. And people want that. They want someone who goes around not just saying nice things but speaking the truth. And Xenocide continues the story directly as Speaker for the Dead. And Xenocide, I'm not sure if it's better than Speaker for the Dead, but I enjoyed it more. I thought it was a powerful conclusion to many of the points and stories in Speaker for the Dead. In a way that Children of the Mind, part of the issue is it kind of ends up being like, what else can we do? Let's just spin off in different directions. Whereas Xenocide is a satisfying conclusion and also an excellent novel in its own right. I think, for me, it is my favourite Ender Quartet book. Number 2, That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. I don't have the matching edition to my other 2 books in the Space Trilogy. This is book 3 of the Space Trilogy. This is just, I've got it second hand, obviously, from Oxfam, I can tell you, because it says so on the back. This is a really beautiful book. It is Lewis, many people would say, not everyone, but many people would say it's Lewis's best book. It is about 400 pages, just under. In that kind of text, but you can see it's a very skinny edition. So about 400 pages. It is the conclusion to the Space Trilogy, and I would say you should read the other books first, though there is a sense of them warming up. You know, the first book is just fun. The second book is really quite good. And then this is an incredible crescendo. But it's also, on its own merits, structurally a completely separate book. What I mean is the first 2 books are told from the perspective of one character, and he goes around doing stuff. And they are planetary adventure, planetary romance books. This is a planetary romance book, but it's set on Earth, and though it involves the same characters to some degree and same story points, same world, it is told from the perspective of 2 different characters who are a married couple, a young married couple who are having marital difficulties as the novel opens, and they come into alignment with different factions who are basically opposing. One comes into alignment with a government institute or a government funded institute which is profoundly interested in using technology and so on to improve humanity, but it becomes clear that there's a soullessness to their work. And then the other comes into contact with a rather organic and eccentric group of people who don't all live out but all work out of this country house with rambling gardens, and they've got a pet bear. And it turns out this is at some level the field for a kind of spiritual and supernatural war and a fulfillment of Arthurian myth as well. And the resolution in the sense of the catharsis and conclusion to this married couple's life and what, the problems they've had and what's happened so far. And it is clever, it is prophetic, it is beautifully written, it's really powerful, very touching, and as I say, many people would say it was Lewis's best novel. There's controversy on that, but you can take your pick. As I say, that is That Hideous Strength, the 3rd in the Space Trilogy. If you haven't read any of the Space Trilogy, probably read all of them, but definitely read That Hideous Strength. Finally, this one will not surprise people, I don't think, but yeah, is this Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, which it's tough. There are 4 books in it, so I don't necessarily have a favourite of those 4 sub-books. Like Lord of the Rings, he wrote it all at once and published it separately over 4 years. And books 2 and 4 are my favourites, and I think often are considered the best 2, not always. But yeah, I like them best probably, so maybe Citadel of the Autarch, the second half of this one, is my favourite. But generally speaking, they're one story and have to be treated like that. There is a coda written at a separate point, Earth of the New Sun. Haven't read that. And there are 7 other books in the solar cycle plus short stories. I am reading Book of the Long Sun, which is a rival for this so far, but I haven't finished it yet. I haven't read the 3rd and 4th books of that. Basically, Severian is a torturer's apprentice who is kicked out of his guild, and he's sent off to go and do a job, kind of for the guild, kind of for the government of this this place in the future. He's sent away, and lots of crazy stuff happens on the way. It's a picaresque adventure. It's an interesting thing where at first you might mistake it for fantasy because, it's all phrased very fantastically, but paying even a little bit of attention, you pick up on increasingly weird things where you realise, oh no, okay, this is the far future, this is sci-fi, but it is not quite technology that is so amazing as to be magical in Clark's sense. Wolf actually has a very different take on that. Rather, that as we lose understanding of what we're doing, as in a sense, maybe it's because we've become decadent, maybe it's just because of the natural entropy of societies at points. People call the technology different things. They understand it as much more normal to them than we would, and that means that they are not saying, I looked at the amazing future device. They're just saying, I looked at the gun, or rather, I looked at the bolt throw, and you're like, is it a crossbow? And it would turn out in fact to be something which, this is not in the book, but phased in dark matter into a bolt and fired it, and we'd think, he's just talking about a crossbow. But for him it's a normal thing. And it's a wonderful world building. It's really interesting narratively. It's narrated by Hyperion, who is, some people would say, he's an unreliable narrator at one level, undeniably, but in another way, there's a debate. Is he that unreliable? And you get massive debates in the Wolf community. And so you've got the structural stuff that's interesting, you've got the world that's really good, and you've got this kind of weird, confusing plot where he's wandering around the world and stuff keeps happening, like, coincidentally, and you're like, is it coincidental? This doesn't seem coincidental. But most of all, it's a character book about Hyperion and this journey of this young man on the verge of adulthood who is thrown out into the world and has to cope with the moral quandaries of a world he literally has no idea about. And this is something which Woolf accomplishes much more naturalistically, ironically, than lots of easier writers. By that I mean, you read lots of writers where structurally they signal, or at least there are tropes that you can identify which are like, he's been mentored by this person, but actually they're a bad guy. Again, not an example here necessarily, but just an example out there. And even if we don't guess the twist, we see the twist has been built up tropically. By that I don't mean via actual instances, but via like, yes, of course he went off and did this. Wolf doesn't do that because none of us actually experience life that simply. He does it much more with much more texture. And so we see Severin, this young man, go out into the world and try to deal with its moral quandaries, try to be a good man, a better man at least, in a world that isn't amenable to understanding, and which changes all the time, and which has all these confusing extra layers to, because it turns out that because of the world building and stuff like that, there is this immensely complex and interesting world. So my favourite sci-fi book at the moment is Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. As I say, Long Sun might bump that. I don't know if I'd then say, no, everything goes down and Long Sun is 1, and New Sun is 2, or whether I'd just replace them, because I often think of my favourite books as crossing all these authors. For Wolfe, I also really like The Fifth Head of Cerberus, and there are loads of other books out there that I've read and really enjoyed. But I think right now, that is my top 10. What are your favourite sci-fi books? I guess, why are they your favourite books? What kind of subgenres do you end up reading more? Do you read a lot of modern stuff or older stuff? Tell me in the comments. Till next time.